The house sits empty. December 1924. Through tall windows, weak winter light falls on dust sheets covering furniture in what was once the grandest ballroom in England. The chandeliers are dark. The silk wallpaper is peeling. In the entrance hall where cabinet ministers once waited to be announced, a single caretaker walks his rounds, footsteps echoing off marble floors that haven't been polished in months. This is Wentworth Woodhouse, the largest private residence in Britain. 765,000 square feet, 365 rooms, one for every day of the year, or so the saying went. Built by coal money, torn apart by coal strikes, a palace that took generations to raise and barely one generation to hollow out. Outside the gates, the mining villages are silent, the pits are closed. Men who once worked 16-hour shifts underground now stand idle, watching their children go hungry. And up on the hill behind those limestone walls, the family that owned the mines and owned the men who worked them counts the cost of a world that's slipping away. This is the story of Britain's millionaire mansions. But it's not about architecture. It's about what happens when empires built on coal and steel and human labor finally run out of people willing to carry the weight. This is the dark story of what happened when the grandest houses in England became monuments to their own excess. This is the story of Britain's forgotten palaces. The mansions were so vast they required their own fire brigades, their own power stations, their own villages of servants just to keep them alive. Houses with names that once commanded respect: Wentworth Woodhouse, Trentham Hall, Whitley Court now reduced to ruins, car parks, or hotels where anyone with a credit card can sleep in rooms where dukes once dressed for dinner. These were not just homes, they were statements. Proof that industrial fortunes could buy more than comfort. They could buy history, legitimacy, a seat at the table with families whose lineage ran back to the Norman conquest. Coal barons and steel magnates built palaces that rivaled royal residences, filling them with art looted from continental estates, furniture commissioned from the finest craftsmen, and servants hired by the hundred to maintain the illusion that all this grandeur was effortless. But beneath the marble floors and gold leaf ceilings ran a truth no amount of beauty could hide. These houses were built by men who made their fortunes breaking other men. The coal that heated the ballrooms came from mines where children worked in darkness. The steel that framed the conservatories was forged in foundries where workers lost fingers, lungs, and lives. The servants who kept the fantasy running earned wages that barely covered rent in cottages the same families owned. For a time, it worked. The system held. Wealth flowed upward, concentrated in fewer and fewer hands, and expressed itself in limestone and oak, in imported marble and hand-painted ceilings. But systems built on exploitation carry their own expiration date. And when the mines began to fail, when the wars came, when inheritance taxes arrived and servants found better options than polishing silver for families who'd never bothered to learn their names, the mansions were left standing. Empty, expensive, impossible to justify. What the tour guides don't mention is this: these houses didn't just fall into ruin by accident. They were abandoned by the same families who'd spent fortunes building them, because maintaining them required admitting how that money was made. Because opening them to the public meant letting in the grandchildren of miners and mill workers, the descendants of people whose labor had funded every chandelier and every carefully manicured acre. This is the complex, uncomfortable story of what happened to Britain's millionaire mansions. This is about beauty and brutality, ambition and collapse, the people who built these places and the people who were broken building them. The money came from underground. By the 1850s, Britain led the world in coal production. The fuel that powered factories, railroads, and steamships emerged from seams deep beneath Yorkshire, Nottinghamshire, and South Wales. The men who controlled those seams, the mine owners, the titled families who happened to own land where coal lay waiting, became staggeringly wealthy almost overnight. This was not inherited nobility built slowly over centuries. This was new money, industrial money, and it arrived with the force and filth of the mines themselves. The fortunes were enormous, but they carried a problem. Money alone didn't guarantee respect. The old aristocracy, families whose names appeared in Domesday Book, looked down on coal wealth as dirty, tainted, not quite legitimate. The industrial rich needed a way to prove they belonged. Their answer was architecture. If you couldn't inherit a palace, you built one. The pattern repeated across the industrial regions. A coal seam was discovered. A family secured mineral rights. Mines were sunk. Within a generation, that family was ordering architects from London, importing marble from Italy, commissioning furniture from the finest craftsmen in Europe. The houses they built were not modest. They were statements. Each one declared that its owner had arrived, that industrial money could command the same respect as ancient lineage. The old aristocracy resisted at first. They sneered at the coal barons who appeared at social gatherings with new titles bought through political donations and strategic marriages. They mocked the garishness of houses built too quickly, with too much money and not enough taste. But resistance couldn't hold. The industrial fortunes were simply too large. By the 1870s, coal magnates were lending money to cash-strapped dukes. They were buying estates that old families could no longer afford to maintain. They were marrying their daughters to titled sons who needed the dowries to pay off debts. The architecture reflected this ambition. These were not subtle country houses tucked discreetly into the landscape. They were palaces designed to be seen from miles away. Facades stretched to impossible lengths. Towers rose high enough to dominate the horizon. The materials were chosen for permanence and spectacle. Limestone that would last centuries, oak paneling that required entire forests, marble fireplaces carved by Italian masters who spent months on a single room. The building boom transformed the English countryside. Villages that had been farming communities for centuries suddenly found themselves in the shadow of massive construction projects. Local labor was hired for the heavy work. Skilled craftsmen were brought in from London, from Europe, from wherever expertise could be found. The projects employed hundreds, sometimes thousands, and took years to complete. The scale was unprecedented, but so was the contradiction. The wealth that funded these palaces came directly from mines where men worked in conditions that killed them young. The same families who insisted on perfection in every carved stone and gilded ceiling paid miners wages that barely covered rent in company-owned cottages. The beauty was real. The exploitation was equally real. And the two were inseparable. Stand at the eastern approach, and the house unfolds like a hallucination. The facade stretches 606 feet, the longest country house front in Europe, longer than Buckingham Palace. Palladian columns rise 3 stories. Stone urns line the roofline. Windows, hundreds of them, catch the morning light. This is Wentworth Woodhouse, and it was built to overwhelm. The Fitzwilliam family, whose coal mines honeycomb the land beneath, began construction in the 1720s, but the house reached its full monstrous scale by the 1800s. The family did not need this much space. No one needed 365 rooms. The point was excess. The point was to announce, louder than words ever could, that coal money was real money, that industrial wealth could command the same architectural grandeur as any duke's estate. But grandeur came with a price that went beyond construction costs. The house actually consists of 2 separate buildings, east and west, connected but architecturally distinct. The older Baroque west front was built first. Then the 4th Marquess of Rockingham, unsatisfied with its scale, commissioned the Palladian east front in the 1740s. The result was architectural schizophrenia. 2 completely different styles sitting side by side, competing for dominance. The east front won. Its sheer length, its classical proportions, its relentless symmetry made the Baroque West seem almost modest by comparison. Inside, the staterooms were designed for entertaining on a royal scale. The marble saloon, with its towering columns and painted ceiling, could hold hundreds for receptions. The long gallery stretched the entire length of the east front, providing space for guests to promenade indoors during bad weather. The pillared hall, dominated by massive Corinthian columns, served as the ceremonial heart of the house. Every surface carried decoration. Plasterwork curled across ceilings. Wood paneling was carved with impossible detail. Marble was everywhere, shipped from quarries across Europe specifically for this project. The construction required infrastructure that rivaled the house itself. Stone came from local quarries, but specialized materials traveled hundreds of miles. A private road was built to carry supplies from the nearest port. Temporary housing went up for workers who couldn't commute daily. A brick kiln operated on site, producing millions of bricks for interior walls. Workshops for carpenters, plasterers, and metalworkers occupied an entire courtyard. The workforce at peak numbered over 1,000 men. Stonemasons shaped blocks by hand, working from architects' drawings that specified every dimension. Carpenters cut oak beams that would support floors and ceilings for centuries. Plasterers mixed compounds to precise consistencies, then applied them in layers, building up the elaborate decorative work that covered the staterooms. The work was dangerous. Men fell from scaffolding. Stone dust destroyed lungs. Injuries were common, and workers who could no longer perform were simply dismissed without compensation. The family rarely watched the construction directly. They reviewed progress during periodic inspections but spent most of their time at other estates. The architects and site managers ran the operation, answerable to the family's standards, but given broad authority over day-to-day decisions. The disconnect was typical. The family wanted the result but preferred not to witness the process. They wanted beauty without seeing the sweat, blood, and occasional death that produced it. The house required an army to function. At its peak, Wentworth Woodhouse employed more than 1,000 people. Not all lived on site, but the core staff housemaids, footmen, cooks, butlers, valets, grooms numbered in the hundreds. They lived below stairs, in corridors and rooms deliberately kept separate from the family's world. Servants used back staircases. They moved through hidden passages. They entered rooms only when summoned, finished their work, and vanished before they could be noticed. The system was designed to create the illusion that the house ran itself. Fires lit before dawn without visible hands. Meals appeared perfectly timed. Beds were made, clothes pressed, silver polished, all while the family and their guests remained blissfully unaware of the labor required. This invisibility was intentional. It was part of the performance. To see the servants would be to acknowledge that wealth required work, that luxury rested on other people's exhaustion. The hierarchy below stairs was rigid and absolute. At the top sat the butler and housekeeper, each commanding their own domain. The butler controlled the male staff and managed the wine cellars, silver, and formal service. The housekeeper oversaw female staff and maintained standards for cleaning, linens, and household supplies. Below them came the upper servants, the lady's maid, the valet, the head cook. These positions carried real authority and better pay. They ate separately from lower servants and enjoyed privileges that marked their status. The bulk of the workforce consisted of footmen, housemaids, and kitchen staff. Footmen served meals, tended fires, carried messages, and performed any task that required male strength or formal presentation. Housemaids cleaned constantly. They rose at 5 in the morning to sweep grates, lay fires, and dust rooms before the family woke. Their work was repetitive and exhausting. Every surface in a house of this size collected dust. Every fireplace needed daily cleaning. Every room required constant attention. Kitchen staff worked in basement spaces that were hot, noisy, and demanding. The coal-fired ranges burned constantly during meal preparation. Temperatures soared. The head cook commanded a team that might include pastry chefs, vegetable cooks, and scullery maids who washed dishes in scalding water. Meals for the family and upper servants required multiple courses, each timed precisely. The staff ate simpler fare, often standing in whatever moments they could steal between tasks. The servants' quarters were cramped and Spartan. Housemaids shared rooms in attics, sleeping 2 or 3 to a bed. Male servants had slightly better accommodations, but nothing approaching comfort. Privacy was non-existent. Personal possessions were minimal. The rooms were unheated in winter, stifling in summer. Most servants owned only 2 or 3 changes of clothing. Uniforms were provided but had to be maintained at the servant's own expense. Wages varied by position but were universally low compared to the wealth around them. A housemaid might earn 12 to 20 pounds per year, roughly half what a factory worker made. Room and board were included, but that meant the servants were never truly off duty. They lived where they worked. The family could summon them at any hour. Days off were rare, usually one afternoon per month. Social lives were nearly impossible to maintain. The emotional toll was rarely documented but clearly present. Servants were expected to show no personality, express no opinions, and accept whatever treatment they received without complaint. A dismissed servant lost not only employment but also housing and references, making future positions difficult to secure. The power imbalance was total, and everyone understood it. 5 miles from Wentworth Woodhouse, the Elskar Main Colliery descended into darkness. Men and boys worked shifts that began before sunrise and ended after sunset. The air was thick with coal dust. Explosions from methane gas killed dozens at a time. Cave-ins buried miners alive. Children as young as 6 worked as trappers, sitting alone in the dark for 12 hours, opening and closing ventilation doors as coal carts passed. The wages were barely enough to rent a cottage in the mining village, cottages that belonged to the Fitzwilliam family, where rent was deducted before the miners saw their pay. This was the source. Every chandelier in the ballroom, every imported marble fireplace, every silk wall covering in the staterooms was paid for by men who would never set foot inside those rooms. The connection was direct and undeniable, though rarely spoken aloud. The coal came up, the money flowed to the house, and the men who did the digging lived and died in the shadow of wealth they would never touch. The mines operated around the clock. Shifts rotated through day and night. Miners descended in cages that dropped hundreds of feet in seconds, a terrifying plunge into heat and darkness. At the bottom, they walked or crawled through narrow tunnels to the coal face. The seams varied in height. Some allowed men to stand. Others forced them to work on their knees or lying on their sides, swinging picks in spaces barely 2 feet high. The work destroyed bodies. Coal dust filled lungs, causing pneumoconiosis, known as black lung. The disease was progressive and fatal. Older miners coughed constantly, struggling for breath that wouldn't come. Back injuries were universal. Lifting coal, swinging picks, hauling carts through low tunnels bent and broke spines. Hands were mangled by equipment. Feet were crushed by falling rock. Minor injuries were ignored. Men worked through pain because missing a shift meant losing pay the family couldn't afford to lose. Explosions were the constant terror. Methane gas, released naturally from coal seams, accumulated in poorly ventilated areas. A single spark from a metal striking stone could ignite it. The blast traveled through tunnels at incredible speed, consuming oxygen and killing through fire or suffocation. Elskar experienced several major disasters. In 1838, an explosion killed 17 men and boys. In 1851, another blast claimed 8 lives. Smaller accidents happened constantly but rarely made records unless multiple men died at once. The mining villages existed in the shadow of the pits. Rows of identical stone cottages lined narrow streets. Each cottage housed a family, sometimes multiple families in 2 or 3 rooms. Water came from communal pumps. Sanitation was primitive, often just a shared privy behind the houses. Disease spreads easily in these conditions. Cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis swept through regularly, killing children and weakened adults. The company store system trapped families in perpetual debt. Miners were often paid in tokens redeemable only at stores owned by the mine, where prices were inflated and quality poor. Real money was rare. Cash wages came irregularly, and when they did, rent and store debts were deducted first. What remained was seldom enough. Families survived on bread, potatoes, and whatever vegetables could be grown in tiny plots behind the cottages. The Fitzwilliam family occasionally visited the villages, distributing charity during holidays or after disasters. These visits were staged carefully. The families presented themselves as benevolent, concerned for their workers' welfare. But the structure never changed. The wages stayed low. The conditions stayed brutal. and the money kept flowing uphill to the house on the ridge. Trentham Hall stood just south of Stoke-on-Trent, another monument to industrial fortune, this time built on pottery and canal money. The Duke of Sutherland's estate sprawled across thousands of acres. The house itself, designed by Sir Charles Barry, architect of the Houses of Parliament, was a masterpiece of Italianate grandeur. Formal gardens stretched toward a mile-long lake. The interiors glowed with gilt and marble. But by the 1900s, something was wrong. The Trent River, which had seemed a picturesque feature when the house was built, was now an open sewer. Factories upstream dumped waste directly into the water. The smell in summer became unbearable. Guests complained. The family tried everything: landscaping, drainage projects, even attempting to reroute the river. Nothing worked. In 1905, they made a decision. Rather than live with the stench of their own industrial wealth, they demolished most of the house. Trentham Hall was torn down not because the family was poor, but because the reality of where the money came from had become too obvious to ignore. The irony was thick enough to choke on. The Sutherland fortune came from pottery factories and industrial enterprises that contributed directly to the pollution destroying their estate. The Duke owned interests in precisely the kinds of factories dumping waste into the river. The wealth and the filth were two sides of the same coin, and when that became impossible to ignore, the solution was not to clean up the river, but to abandon the house. The demolition was methodical. Contractors moved in and began stripping the interiors first. Anything valuable was removed and sold. Marble fireplaces went to salvage dealers. Wood paneling was carefully extracted for reuse elsewhere. Fixtures, doors, even sections of decorative plasterwork were auctioned. What couldn't be salvaged was smashed. Crews worked through the house room by room, reducing Barry's Italianate masterpiece to piles of rubble. The gardens were partially maintained. The family retained some land and kept the parkland accessible, but the house itself was mostly erased. Portions of the facade remained, standing like broken teeth, monuments to wealth that couldn't tolerate its own consequences. Visitors today can walk the gardens and see fragments: a terrace here, a partial wall there, but the grand house is gone. The decision revealed something fundamental about the industrial rich. They wanted the benefits of industry without living with its costs. They wanted the money from factories that blackened the sky and poisoned the rivers, but they wanted to live in pastoral elegance, surrounded by beauty that pretended those factories didn't exist. When the pretense became impossible, when the smell reached even the estate, the solution was retreat, not reform. Neighboring estates watched and learned. The pollution that destroyed Trentham was spreading. Other rivers were dying. The air in industrial regions was thick with soot. Houses near factories or mines faced similar problems. Some families installed elaborate filtration systems. Others planted dense screens of trees, hoping to create barriers against the smog. A few simply moved, spending less time at estates near industrial centers and more time at properties in cleaner regions. But moving didn't solve the fundamental problem. The money still came from the same sources. The coal still had to be mined, the pottery still had to be fired, the steel still had to be forged. The industrial machine that generated the wealth required fuel, heat, and chemical processes that inevitably produced waste. That waste had to go somewhere. Usually it went into the nearest river or into the air, and eventually it came back. Whitley Court was a stone, built in the 1850s for the Earl of Dudley, whose fortune came from coal and ironworks. The house was designed to impress. The Perseus fountain in the gardens, one of the largest in Europe, shot water 100 feet into the air. The interiors dripped with gold leaf, crystal, and imported marble. State dinners could seat 100 guests beneath painted ceilings that depicted mythological scenes of triumph and plenty. But maintaining this required money, and by the 1930s that money was running out. The coal industry was in decline. Inheritance taxes were crushing. In 1937, a fire broke out. The blaze tore through the house, gutting the roof and destroying much of the interior. The family, already struggling, made a calculation. Rebuilding would cost a fortune. Instead, they sold what they could: furnishings, fixtures, anything with value, and walked away. Whitley Court was left to the elements. Rain poured through the open roof. Floors rotted. Walls cracked. What fire didn't destroy, time finished. The ruin stands today, a shell, beautiful in its decay, a monument to wealth that couldn't sustain itself once the source dried up. The fire started in the early morning hours, possibly from an electrical fault in one of the upper rooms. By the time staff noticed, flames had spread through the roof space. The house's timber framing, bone dry after decades, caught quickly. Fire crews arrived from nearby towns, but the scale overwhelmed them. Water pressure was inadequate. The house was too large. Flames spread faster than they could be contained. The family was in residence when the fire broke out. They evacuated safely, but watched from the gardens as the house burned. Witnesses described the Earl standing silent, illuminated by flames that consumed his family's seat. By dawn, the roof had collapsed. The interior was gutted. Walls stood, blackened and cracked, but everything inside was destroyed or damaged beyond repair. Insurance covered some of the loss, but not enough. The policy valued furnishings and structure, but rebuilding to the original standard would require far more. The Earl was already facing financial pressure. The Dudley coal mines were producing less. Cheaper coal from abroad was undercutting British producers. Inheritance taxes from his father's death a decade earlier had drained cash reserves. The estate was land-rich but cash-poor, a common problem among aristocratic families in the interwar years. The decision to abandon the house was pragmatic but painful. Whitley Court had been in the family for generations. It represented their rise from industrial nouveau rich to established aristocracy. Walking away felt like admitting defeat, but keeping up appearances would have required selling off land, possibly dismantling other parts of the estate. The alternative was to cut losses, salvage what could be sold, and move to a smaller, more manageable property. The salvage operation took months. Anything that survived the fire and had value was stripped out. Lead from the roof was sold for scrap. Doors, window frames, sections of paneling that escaped the flames went to architectural salvage dealers. Marble fireplaces were carefully removed and auctioned. The Perseus fountain, still functional, remained in the gardens, too large and expensive to move. By 1938, the house was an empty shell. The windows were boarded up. The grounds, once meticulously maintained, began to overgrow. Local people started using the ruin as a source of building materials. Stone was carted away. Metal fixtures disappeared. The house slowly dissolved into the landscape. During the Second World War, the military briefly used portions of the estate for training, but the house itself was too dangerous to enter. Post-war, it sat abandoned. In the 1970s, English Heritage took control of the ruin, stabilizing the walls and opening the site to visitors. Today, Whitley Court is a managed ruin, a picturesque symbol of faded glory. The First World War shattered the illusion of permanence. Young men from mining families and country estates alike were sent to France and Flanders, where industrial warfare machine guns, artillery, poison gas killed them by the hundreds of thousands. The men who survived came home changed, less willing to accept the old hierarchies, less convinced that the families in the big houses deserved automatic deference. Meanwhile, the government requisitioned many of the great estates. Wentworth Woodhouse became a training depot. Other mansions turned into hospitals, barracks, storage facilities. The families watched as their private worlds were invaded by soldiers, bureaucrats, and the machinery of total war. When the war ended, everything had shifted. Inheritance taxes introduced in 1914 and raised repeatedly afterward began to bite. Families that had weathered centuries found themselves land-rich and cash-poor, unable to pay the taxes on estates they could no longer afford to maintain. The Second War, starting in 1939, finished what the First had started. Requisitions resumed. Staff shortages became acute. Fuel rationing made heating vast houses impossible. By 1945, the system that had supported these mansions' cheap labor, unchallenged deference, concentrated wealth was gone. The requisitions were not optional. The government identified properties with sufficient space and infrastructure, issued orders, and moved in. Families were given notice, sometimes only days, to clear out. Private apartments were carved from the houses, but most of the space went to military use. Wentworth Woodhouse housed regiments preparing for deployment. The ballrooms became barracks, the staterooms held equipment. Soldiers drilled on the lawns that had been manicured for generations. The damage was considerable. Military use is hard on buildings. Floors were scarred by heavy equipment. Walls were damaged by makeshift plumbing and electrical installations. The fine plasterwork and woodwork suffered from lack of care. The military was focused on function, not preservation. When units moved out, they left behind spaces that needed extensive restoration the families could no longer afford. Staff shortages compounded the problem. Men went to war. Women took factory jobs that paid better than domestic service. The servant class, which had made these houses function, was evaporating. By 1918, families found it impossible to hire the numbers they needed. Wages rose as workers realized they had leverage. The automatic deference that had governed relationships between servants and employers was cracking. Workers began to question why they should polish silver for families who'd sent their sons to die in the same trenches where the miners' sons had died. The inheritance taxes were designed to break up large estates. The 1914 tax started at modest rates, but increased significantly through the 1920s and 30s. When a titled head of family died, the estate owed a substantial percentage of its value to the government. The problem was liquidity. These families owned land, houses, art, but relatively little cash. Paying the tax meant selling assets. Land went first, then collections. Families sold off tenant farms, parcels of woodland, entire villages to raise cash for the tax bill. The impact was cumulative. Each generation that died triggered another tax bill, another forced sale. Estates that had been consolidated over centuries fragmented within decades. The large land holdings that had supported both the houses and the family's social position dissolved. By the 1930s, many aristocratic families had been reduced to little more than the house itself and a small surrounding park, with insufficient income to maintain either. The Second World War completed the process. Requisitions came again. Fuel rationing made heating impossible. Food rationing limited entertaining. The houses stood dark and cold. Families who tried to maintain them found it nearly impossible. When peace came in 1945, the Labour government's policies made clear that the old system was not coming back. High taxes stayed. Labour protections strengthened. The servant class was gone for good. The families faced a choice: adapt radically or give up entirely. Wentworth Woodhouse survived the wars. The house stood, battered but intact. Then, in 1946, the newly elected Labour government made a decision that looked like policy but felt like revenge. The government needed coal, desperately. Britain was rebuilding. Fuel shortages were crippling the economy. Open-cast mining stripping away the surface soil to reach coal seams was faster and cheaper than deep mining. The land directly in front of Wentworth Woodhouse held coal, so the government began digging, not discreetly. Not at a distance, within yards of the house. The Fitzwilliam family protested. The estate's beauty, its historical significance, the gardens laid out over centuries, none of it mattered. The coal mattered. The machines moved in. Topsoil was scraped away. The noise was constant. Dust covered everything. The family watched from the windows as the landscape they'd spent generations perfecting was torn apart. Some called it economic necessity. Others saw it as the settling of accounts. The miners' families, who had lived for generations in the shadow of the big house, saw the land ripped open and felt a grim satisfaction. The wealth had always come from underground. Now the ground itself was being taken back. The decision was announced with little warning. Government surveyors appeared on the estate, marking boundaries, testing soil. The family was informed that open-cast mining would begin within weeks. Their objections were heard politely and ignored. The Minister of Fuel and Power, Emmanuel Shinwell, was unmoved by appeals to history or beauty. Britain needed coal. The land held coal. The math was simple. The 8th Earl Fitzwilliam fought back through every channel available. He wrote letters to newspapers, lobbied members of Parliament, appealed directly to the Prime Minister. He argued that open-cast mining would destroy parkland that had been carefully designed over 2 centuries, that it would irreparably damage a building of national importance, that alternative sites existed. His arguments were factually correct. They were also politically useless. The government had nationalized the coal industry. The state now controlled mineral rights, and the state had decided this coal was necessary. The machines arrived in early 1947. Massive mechanical shovels, earth movers, dump trucks. They began at the edge of the estate and worked inward. The topsoil was scraped off and piled in mounds, then the subsoil, then they hit the coal seam. The operation ran day and night. The noise was industrial, mechanical, relentless. Explosions were used to break up rock. The ground shook. Windows in the house rattled. Dust drifted across the estate, coating everything: trees, grass, the house itself in a fine layer of grit. The environmental destruction was immediate and severe. Drainage patterns were disrupted. Streams that had flowed through the parkland for centuries were diverted or disappeared entirely. Trees, some of them hundreds of years old, were uprooted. The carefully landscaped views that had been the estate's pride were replaced by open pits and industrial machinery. The contrast was brutal. On one side of the house, the formal gardens and remaining parkland. On the other, a moonscape of torn earth and extraction equipment. The family's daily life became surreal. They continued to live in the house, but surrounded by industrial mining. The juxtaposition was almost absurd. Afternoon tea in the drawing room while earth movers roared outside. Dinner in the state dining room while explosions echoed across what had been the south lawn. The psychological impact was significant. This was not just destruction. It was humiliation. A public demonstration that the family's objections, their history, their status, meant nothing against the state's needs. The political symbolism was not lost on anyone. The Fitzwilliams had made their fortune from coal mines that had brutalized generations of workers. Now the state, controlled by labor, was using that same coal to fund reconstruction, and they were taking it from the family's own front garden. The workers operating the equipment were often from local mining families. They knew exactly whose land they were tearing up. Some took satisfaction in it, others felt conflicted. The job paid wages. But the symbolism cut deep. The art came down from the walls first. By the 1950s and 60s, families facing bankruptcy began selling their collections piece by piece. Paintings that had hung in the same gallery for 200 years went to auction houses in London. American buyers, newly wealthy after the war, snapped up old masters, Renaissance sculptures and furniture that once filled state rooms. What had taken generations to assemble vanished in a series of sales catalogues. The families called it rationalization, downsizing, making things manageable. But everyone understood what it really meant. These were capitulations. Admissions that the old world was over, that keeping up appearances was no longer possible, that the houses themselves had become tombs for collections no one could afford to insure or maintain. Some pieces went to museums. Many went to private collectors. A few disappeared into storage, waiting for markets to recover. The houses, stripped of their contents, felt even emptier than before. Rooms that had been designed around specific paintings or furniture now echoed. The architecture remained, but the meaning had been gutted. The sales followed a predictable pattern. Financial pressure mounted slowly. Taxes came due. Maintenance costs exceeded income. Loans were taken against the collections. When the loans couldn't be repaid, the creditors forced sales. Or a death triggered inheritance taxes large enough that selling was the only option. The families resisted as long as possible. They sold tenant farms first, then outlying properties, then land closest to the house. Only when no other assets remained did the collections go to auction. The auction houses handled these sales with discretion. Christie's and Sotheby's in London catalogued the pieces, arranged viewing days, and conducted auctions that drew international buyers. The catalogues themselves were elaborate productions, with photographs, provenance details, and essays by art historians. The objects were presented as investments, treasures, opportunities. The catalogues never mentioned the desperation behind the sales. American collectors dominated many of these auctions. The Gilded Age fortunes Rockefeller, Morgan, Mellon had survived the Depression. After the war, they sought to import European culture to legitimize new money. They bought entire collections, sometimes entire rooms. Furniture, paintings, tapestries, even sections of wood paneling and carved fireplaces were purchased, crated, and shipped across the Atlantic. American mansions and museums filled with pieces that had once defined British aristocratic taste. Some families tried to keep specific pieces. They negotiated with the government to accept artworks in lieu of tax payments. This arrangement allowed particularly important pieces to stay in Britain, transferred to museums as part of the national collection. The family lost ownership but could claim they had preserved heritage. The paintings moved from private walls to public galleries. The names remained attached. This had belonged to the Duke of X, that to the Earl of Y, but the connection was now historical, not present. The emotional toll was rarely discussed publicly. These objects were not just assets, they were family history, portraits of ancestors, furniture that had been in the same rooms for generations, books collected by great-grandparents. Losing them felt like losing identity. But discussing that loss openly would seem self-pitying in a country that had endured war, rationing, and reconstruction. So the families stayed silent, issued brief statements about prudent estate management, and watched as their heritage was catalogued and sold. The houses changed fundamentally once the collections were gone. Walls that had been covered with paintings showed pale rectangles where frames had hung for decades. Rooms designed to display specific pieces felt purposeless. The architecture had been built around the collections. Without them, the scale felt wrong. Ballrooms meant for crowds of guests surrounded by grandeur now felt cavernous and empty. Libraries stripped of books became echoing shells. The houses had become stage sets without props, architecture without context. Some families filled the gaps with lesser pieces, reproductions, or rearranged what remained to hide the losses. Others left the spaces empty, perhaps hoping that someday they could rebuild. Most never did. The great collections assembled over centuries dispersed in decades, and the houses stood, beautiful but hollow, monuments to wealth that could no longer sustain itself. The National Trust, founded in 1895 to preserve places of historic interest, became the last resort for families who couldn't afford their estates but couldn't bear to see them destroyed. The arrangement was straightforward. Donate the house and enough land to support it, and the trust would preserve the property, open it to the public, and keep the family name attached. For some families, this felt like salvation. For others, it was humiliation. Handing over your ancestral home to an organization that would let school children run through the halls, that would turn private drawing rooms into tea shops, that would put ropes across furniture to keep visitors from sitting where your grandparents had entertained royalty, this was not victory, but it was better than demolition. By the 1970s, dozens of great houses had passed to the trust. They were preserved, yes, but they were no longer homes. They were museums. Monuments. The families retained some access, sometimes living in private apartments carved out of the old servants' quarters, but the houses themselves belonged to the public. The irony was sharp. The people whose labor had built and maintained these estates, who'd been kept below stairs and out of sight, could now pay a few pounds and walk freely through every room their ancestors had been forbidden to enter. The transfer process was complex and often painful. Negotiations could take years. The trust assessed the property's historic and architectural significance. They evaluated the condition of the buildings, calculated maintenance costs, and determined what endowment was necessary to support preservation. The family had to prove they could provide sufficient land and funding. If the property was encumbered by debt, that had to be cleared before transfer. If the collection had been depleted by sales, the trust decided whether what remained justified preservation. The terms were non-negotiable in their essentials. The house would be open to the public. The trust would control access, set visiting hours, determine which rooms could be shown, and manage the property's commercial use. Families negotiating for private apartments found the trust firm about separation. The family could not interfere with public access or operations. They were, in effect, tenants in their own ancestral home. The emotional adjustment was difficult. Families accustomed to absolute privacy suddenly heard strangers walking overhead, voices echoing in halls that had been private for generations. The houses filled with school groups, tourists, wedding parties renting the grounds. The smell of tea shop food drifted through the corridors. Gift shops sold postcards of rooms where the family had dined. The transformation from home to tourist attraction was complete. The Trust's preservation standards were high but focused on specific priorities. Structural integrity came first. Roofs were repaired, walls stabilized, essential systems maintained. Aesthetic restoration was secondary. If original wallpaper survived, it was preserved. If it was gone, cheaper modern alternatives often replaced it. The Trust worked within budgets that required balancing preservation against visitor experience and commercial viability. Some compromises were necessary. Not every room could be restored to original splendor. Not every piece of furniture could be replaced if it had been sold. The public response was mixed. Working-class visitors, many of whom had family histories tied to these estates as servants or tenants, had complicated reactions. Some felt vindicated, finally able to walk through spaces their grandparents had cleaned. Others felt uncomfortable, aware of the histories of exploitation these houses represented. Middle-class visitors often approached the houses with uncritical admiration, seeing beauty and heritage without considering cost. Upper-class visitors sometimes lamented the commercialization, mourning the loss of exclusivity. The Trust itself evolved in its presentation of these properties. Early on, the focus was purely architectural and aesthetic. Tour guides described the beauty of the rooms, the quality of the craftsmanship, the taste of the owners. Labor and exploitation were rarely mentioned. By the 1980s and 90s, this began to change. New exhibitions acknowledged servants' roles. Basement tours showed the working areas. Interpretive materials started to discuss the sources of wealth. The shift was gradual and incomplete, but it represented a significant change in how these houses were understood and presented. For the families, the bargain was permanent. Once transferred, the properties would never return to private ownership. Future generations would have no claim beyond the negotiated apartments. The family name remained attached, appearing on brochures and plaques, but the connection was historical, not functional. The houses had been saved from demolition, but at the cost of everything that had made them feel like homes. Not every house found a savior. Between 1945 and 1975, more than 1,000 country houses were demolished in Britain. Some were bombed during the war and left too damaged to repair. Some were simply too expensive, too remote, too impractical to preserve. The demolition crews moved in. Roofs came off first. Then the floors were torn up. Staircases ripped out. Fireplaces smashed. Anything salvageable was sold: paneling, doors, fixtures to salvage yards, or wealthy buyers looking for authentic period details for their own renovations. What couldn't be saved was knocked down. Hamilton Palace in Scotland, once one of the grandest houses in Britain, was demolished in the 1920s due to subsidence from coal mining beneath its foundations. The irony was brutal. The very coal that had paid for the palace destroyed it. Other houses fell to changing economics. Estates that required dozens of staff could no longer find workers willing to accept the wages and conditions. Heating costs alone could bankrupt a family. The land might hold value, but the buildings on it had become liabilities. So they were erased, turned into rubble, plowed under. In some cases, housing estates or car parks now occupy sites where ballrooms once glittered. The demolition of Hamilton Palace happened in stages between 1919 and 1927. The palace had been built in the 17th century and expanded continuously, becoming one of Scotland's most impressive houses. But the Hamilton family's wealth came from coal mines that honeycombed the land beneath the estate. By the early 20th century, subsidence was severe. Walls cracked, floors tilted. Structural damage made the building dangerous. The family commissioned reports. Engineers confirmed the building could not be saved. The coal that had funded its construction was literally pulling it down. The demolition attracted attention. Architectural salvage dealers bid on everything. The contents were auctioned: first furniture, paintings, books, sculptures. Then the structure itself was systematically dismantled. Carved stone went to dealers. The massive marble staircase was purchased and reinstalled elsewhere. Fireplaces, doors, and entire rooms of paneling were extracted and sold. What remained was broken down for aggregate or burned. The site was eventually cleared and the family rebuilt on a much smaller scale elsewhere on the estate. Other demolitions followed different patterns. Some houses were simply too large for post-war reality. Families that had employed 50 servants could now afford 5. Houses designed to accommodate weekend parties of 30 guests sat empty most of the year. Heating systems designed for cheap coal became impossibly expensive as fuel prices rose. The arithmetic was brutal. The houses cost more to maintain than they generated in rent or other income, and they couldn't be sold because no one wanted them. The decision to demolish was often agonizing. These were family homes, sometimes for centuries. Ancestors were buried in the chapel grounds. Family portraits hung on the walls. Childhood memories filled every room, but sentiment couldn't pay the bills. Families delayed as long as possible, borrowing against the land, selling collections, cutting every possible cost. When nothing else worked, demolition became the only option. The process was destructive and efficient. Demolition crews were professionals who worked quickly. They stripped the valuable materials first, then brought in heavy equipment. Roofs were pulled down. Load-bearing walls were knocked out. The structures collapsed section by section. Sites that had held grand houses for hundreds of years were reduced to rubble in weeks. The debris was usually buried on site or used to fill foundations for new construction. The cultural loss was incalculable. Many of these houses had architectural features that were unique: ceilings painted by masters, plasterwork by craftsmen whose techniques were no longer taught, gardens designed by the leading landscape architects of their eras, libraries that held centuries of accumulated knowledge. All of this was destroyed because preservation was impossible or impractical. Some demolitions sparked protests. Architectural preservation groups tried to intervene, but they had limited power and resources. They could publicize impending demolitions, pressure local councils, and appeal to the government. Sometimes they succeeded in delaying demolition long enough to salvage specific features. More often, they simply documented what was being lost, photographing rooms before they were destroyed, cataloging fixtures before they were sold. The sites themselves often tell the story. Visitors today can find foundations, bits of wall, overgrown gardens. Some sites have been completely erased, built over with housing developments or commercial buildings. Others remain as empty fields, the only evidence a slight irregularity in the ground or a line of mature trees that once lined a drive. The ghosts are there if you know where to look. The ruins remain. Some are official heritage sites, carefully maintained as romantic follies. Others are unofficial, quietly decaying behind chain-link fences, visited only by urban explorers and photographers hunting for dramatic shots of collapsed roofs and ivy-covered stone. The mansions that survived weather as national trust properties, private hotels, or institutional buildings carry layered meanings. To some, they're monuments to British achievement, examples of architectural genius and the heights human ambition can reach. To others, they're evidence of exploitation, physical proof of how wealth concentrates and what it costs the people who generate it. Both readings are true. The houses are beautiful. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. The scale and vision are undeniable. And they were built on the backs of miners who died young, servants who worked until their bodies gave out, and entire communities whose labor was extracted and never fairly compensated. The lesson isn't simple. It's not that wealth is inherently evil or that beauty should be torn down because it was purchased unjustly. The lesson is that grandeur always has a price, and that price is always paid by someone. The question is whether we acknowledge that price, whether we remember the names and stories of the people who carried it, or whether we simply admire the chandeliers and move on. The surviving mansions function today in ways their builders never imagined. Chatsworth hosts concerts and flower shows. Castle Howard appears in period dramas. Blenheim Palace charges admission and fills its rooms with tourists photographing the same ceilings that once witnessed private family moments. The transformation is complete. What were private worlds are now public spectacles. The exclusivity that defined them has been replaced by accessibility, though that accessibility still requires entrance fees that exclude those who can't afford them. The interpretation of these sites continues to evolve. Modern curators face pressure to acknowledge the full history. This means discussing not only the architectural achievements, but also the labor conditions, the source of the wealth, the role these families played in industrial exploitation and colonial ventures. Some properties have embraced this. They've added exhibitions about servants' lives, included below-stairs areas in tours, commissioned research into the workers who built and maintained the estates. Others remain focused primarily on the beauty and the stories of the families, treating the labor as background detail rather than central narrative. The physical legacy is mixed. The mansions that survived do preserve remarkable architecture and craftsmanship. Skills that might have been lost entirely are documented in these buildings. Students of architecture can study proportion, materials, construction techniques that spanned centuries. Conservationists have learned how to maintain historic structures, techniques that apply to other heritage sites. The gardens preserve landscape design traditions. The collections that stayed together provide windows into art history and aristocratic taste. But preservation has been selective. The houses that survived were usually the most spectacular, or the ones where families could negotiate transfers to the trust. More modest country houses, less architecturally distinguished, but still historically important, often didn't make the cut. The pattern of what was saved reflects aesthetic and political judgments about what deserved preservation. Working-class housing from the same era was demolished almost universally. The miners' cottages, the industrial housing, the physical infrastructure of the working communities that supported these estates, almost all of that is gone. The imbalance is stark. We preserved the palaces and erased the workers' homes. The cultural legacy is complicated. These houses feature in countless films and television shows. They've become shorthand for period elegance, for a romanticized past of aristocratic grace. Downton Abbey and similar productions use them as settings for dramas that often minimize the class conflict and exploitation that defined the era. The houses enable fantasies of a gentler, more orderly time, fantasies that erase the brutal realities of industrial capitalism and rigid class hierarchies. Yet the houses also enable conversations about inequality. They make visible the physical manifestation of wealth concentration. Standing in a ballroom the size of most people's entire homes, you cannot avoid confronting the disparity. The scale forces recognition. And for visitors willing to look beyond the beauty, the houses raise questions about how societies organize resources, whose labor is valued, what we choose to remember, and what we choose to forget. The mansions are mirrors. What we see in them depends on how honestly we're willing to look.